political science, and he's received both his master's degree in the University of Pittsburgh in public and international affairs and his Ph.D. in political science at the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Misawa does his research in Nigerian foreign policy, conflicts in West African security, and U.S. foreign policy towards Africa. Dr. Misawa has published in the Economic Community of West African States, Middle East and Africa, African Chieftaincy, and the Darfur conflict in Sudan. He's currently working on a book, The Dimensions of African Security Problems, and co-author of another book forthcoming actually in December called The Making of a Chief Servant, the biography of the Taliban leader and the governor of Niger State in Nigeria. Professor Misawa is the recipient of many distinguished research honors, such as the International Public Service Award, Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, the University of Pittsburgh, the Fulbright Hayes, the Washington and Jefferson College President's Entrepreneurial Fund for Summer Research, and the Overseas Study Abroad Fellowship. He has been a consultant to the University of Gambia in numerous ways since its founding. Dr. Misawa was a member of the international panel that set up the University of Gambia in 2000. Professor Misawa has completed numerous study trips to the Gambia and Senegal with students from Washington and Jefferson, the University of Pittsburgh, Carnegie Mellon University, and Juanita College since 2001.
Thank you. Thanks for that gracious introduction. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. Well, I want to thank the organizers for this, and I hope this afternoon you're awake enough to hear us. I want to acknowledge CMU. I know you guys are not into politics. The presenters before me have done a great job. Now I'm going to give you a dose of politics. How about that? It's very impressive, I think, to have the provost from CMU among us. What a better way to fund programs, educational programs, having the provost here. And I was just told that you always attended this program, so that's wonderful. And I think you guys are lucky enough. 90% of these people in here are from CMU, so that's great. And you're lucky enough to have someone who supports such programs. And we're going to copy from you. We look forward to that at Washington and Jefferson College. I'll tell the dean to make sure that we get something like that. So anyway, as I mentioned, the previous people have done a great job. But there was something missing. How about politics? That's what defines everything for us, is that right? So I'm going to talk about Nigeria's security issue as it relates to the rise of Boko Haram. And Boko Haram, as you well know, you could see it in the context of Nigerian politics, and yet you could see it in the context of worldwide, perhaps Islamic resurgence, or at least in terms of the rise of fringe groups in the Islamic narrative, or certainly in the Muslim narrative around the world. So, but before starting on the contemporary, I want to borrow from historians. The conflict as it is today, Boko Haram's conflict, is centered in the north of Nigeria. And northern Nigeria is not new to Islamic revivalism or the argument about Islam. And the contest within Islam itself was certainly the context between Islam and other societies. So I will go back to the 18th century, beginning 19th century, in northern Nigeria. As Professor Mark said, all the things she said, I was so excited because Kano is my area. She taught at my alma mater. We overlapped while she was there. So everything she was saying, I was just having goosebumps, so to say, and excited. And everybody, the pictures that she showed, I know most of the people in there, and so it's very exciting. So in the early 19th century, we had Islamic revivalist movement in the form of series of jihads that were witnessed in West Africa, and some of the movements are instrumental to what we see today in Nigeria. First and foremost, as was mentioned yesterday, the rise of Islam in Arabia was indeed immensely important to Africa. It was, and it remains so. The future of Africa was defined in part by the rise of Islam in Arabia. Similarly, the religious message, the spread of that religious message remained very critical at that point, and it was perhaps the singular mode of interaction between Africa and most of the world at that point, through the Islamic message. And so Islam became not only the chief, Africa's chief contact with the rest of the world, but indeed it overshadowed most of traditional Africa in many ways. There is a point that has been made, I think, that is very essential, that the spread of Islam in Africa did not necessarily correspond with the introduction of Arab culture. So Islam was accepted by many, especially in Kano and the rest of the people, and yet the Arab culture was indeed pushed, a little bit further. Some societies accepted both Islam and the Arab culture, but most of the Hausa state accepted Islam without the Arab culture. So here we are. There were two major jihads that gave impetus to the jihad in northern Nigeria. The first was the so-called Futa Jalon jihad. Futa Jalon, F-U-T-A Jalon, A-J-A-L-O-N, Futa Jalon jihad. The Futa Jalon jihad occurred between 1725 to 1750. Now, you guys are of American history. What was the significance, or what is the significance of 1750 in American history? Anyone? 1750. Where are the Americans when I need them? Pardon? What is that? Okay, the rise, that was the beginning of the tax system, when the British were indeed taxing people. And in part of the Futa Jalon jihad was a reaction to the tax system that was imposed on the pastoralists in West Africa. Futa Jalon corresponds with today's Guinea, and Guinea was in the news and existed in the news because of the Ebola, but that's where Futa Jalon is. It corresponds with that. So, an Islamic scholar who had accepted Islam from North Africa, as was narrated yesterday and this morning, became interested in the reform process. The Fulbe, the pastoralists or the Fulani, who were the main people who brought in Islam to West Africa, were being overtaxed by the traditional leaders in those areas. So they revolted. Their revolt was preceded by another movement, the so-called Al-Murabitin, or the Al-Murabids. So you had all this series of movements that were going on, Islamic movements. And Futa Jalon became important to that in the process. That jihad between 1725 to 1750 led to the creation of the Islamic State in the region. The second jihad that followed the Futa-Jalan jihad was the Futa-Toro jihad. F-U-T-A, and then last was T-O-R-O, Toro, like the company Toro, is that right? So you have Futa-Toro, and this was led by a Tukolo and a Fulani, two people that led the jihad in that context, and it led to the creation of the Tukolo Fulbe state also. But this one, jihad was 1769 to 1776. What's the significance of 1776 in American history? Wasn't the American Revolution. So I do teach a course on American politics, and I make the argument in that class that the American Revolution introduced to the world a universal concept of democracy. But I take it quickly to my students and remind them, but in 1776, Africans were revolting against their own institutions on similar arguments. 1776 was part of the revolt of the tax system and oppressive government. Is that right? And here we are. Also, some of you who may argue that democracy is new in Africa will take that argument, but you have to be limited by the fact that in 1776 we were revolting against oppressive institutions also, similar along the line of America. 1776, people were revolting. And you can look at the food, you guys have your computers, so check them out and see some of those things. So, these two jihad, therefore, inspired Futa-Jalan and Futa-Turo, inspired another jihad, and the jihad of Usman Dan Fodio, whose daughter was the subject of discussion by Professor Mark this afternoon. Usman Dan Fodio led the 1804 jihad in Nigeria, in northern Nigeria. And the reasons for the jihad, these were the original Hausa states. These states here were the original Hausa states, and these states had accepted, some of them have accepted Islam, but they had all these corrupt practices that were going on. They were very oppressive. And Usman Dan Fodio wanted to challenge the social structure, but at the same time also institute Islam in its pure form. So the 1804 jihad was established and was imposed on these states. So the Fulani or the Fulbe overthrew the Hausa political systems, because they too, just like it was in Futa-Toro and Futa-Jalan, the Fulani people, who are the pastoralists, were being overtaxed by their Hausa leaders. And being overtaxed for their cattle, for everything they did, but there were no services, and these guys were corrupt and did everything. And of course, they were practicing traditional African religion, or most of them were nominal Muslims, combining with whatever practices they wanted. And so Usman Dan Fodio came in with that idea of that. So Islam therefore provided an alternative to judging the political system. The idea that Sharia was an alternative way of looking at justice and fairness in society became very important. Both in the two previous jihads, but certainly in the jihad in northern Nigeria. And that's the basis. So northern Nigeria, after all these things, was then colonized by the British. After this creation of the Islamic State. And the 1804 jihad created the largest state system in West Africa, one single state system in West Africa. The 1804 jihad. It extended beyond Nigeria, beyond the Hausa states, to cover other states. So it became singular largest state, composing of so many other societies. And that point is very important and very relevant to understanding that, because the creation of the state became Sokoto Caliphate, the Caliphate. The Sokoto Caliphate. And in today's politics in Nigeria, we still talk about the Caliphate. Oh, right here, the Caliphate. Sokoto Caliphate. And today's argument about Hausas and Fulanis. So the Fulanis overthrew the Hausa system, but just like with Islam and Arabic, the Hausas, the Fulanis were successful in instituting Islam, but Hausa culture dominated the Fulanis. So the Fulanis then became absorbed into the Hausa culture. So in the context of Nigerian politics today, the Hausas and the Fulanis are called the Hausa Fulani. And they constitute one large group in the political structure. And that large political structure is very important in understanding the rise of these fringe groups in Nigeria, and down to the form of Boko Haram. So the growth of corruption and injustice led Anfodio to overthrow these Hausa systems. And today, some of the arguments about Boko Haram is that they are trying to fight a corrupt system and therefore trying to overthrow the government in that context. Some of the arguments are very similar. You just wonder whether today's argument is sincere, because Anfodio did not necessarily use some of the methods that have been used, are used today in creating that kind of argument. So, fast forward, with the caliphate in place, the colonialists came, and we had the colonial argument. Africa was arbitrarily divided without regards to any concerns for family, ethnic groups, and whatever. So you have the straight down borders in the 1884 Berlin Conference, where Africa was partitioned. And that arbitrariness is still central to many arguments in Africa, especially in Nigeria. What that happened then was that the people in northern Nigeria and southern Nigeria, I missed it, huh? Is that good enough, Mark? Right. So, as it is now, where will I get the map of Nigeria with all the states? As it is now, this is where the conflict is, this area here. So, the people of the north, who saw themselves distinct and had a caliphate, and the people of the south, who saw themselves as distinct and with their own empires. You have the Oyo Empire, the Benin Empire, you have the Igbo land, and all this. Everybody with the British just came in, drilled these lines, and lumped everyone together. Just like this in most Africa. They lumped everyone together, and that argument is still an uncertain debate in Africa. So, post-colonial conflicts, one may argue in general terms, are as a result of the arbitrariness that was created through colonial process. They do remain. There's a limit to that argument, and one may, I will accept that. There's a limit to that argument, that indeed, but what has happened is that in post-colonial Africa, there has been a politicization of this ethnic and communal lines that were drawn by the colonialists. In the case of Nigeria, it was the British who arbitrarily, drew these lines and brought everybody together as one nation, and that. So the post-colonial environment created the so-called competition for ethnic identity, It also created competition for loyalties between the state and those boundaries, the traditional boundaries. The state is still not a legitimate argument in most of Africa. It's not being consolidated. People have not come to internalize that. So most people would say, yes, I'm a Nigerian or I'm a Tanzanian in general, but they have not necessarily internalized or accepted the legitimacy of the state as it were. And without the acceptance of the legitimacy of the state, everything is a contested boundary. That's what we have. You know, if you can explain some of the conflicts in Sudan or in Rwanda, the Rwandese are the same people in general, historically, and yet these people were very intense in that. Why? Just like it was in Rwanda, what the British did in Nigeria was to select the so-called superior native and the inferior natives. The superior natives in Nigeria were the Hausas. So we are the ones who are seen as though this is our guy. We can deal with them. Is that right? And the rest of the people, we want you to go and do everything against them. So the Tutsis were chosen by the Belgians as this is our guy against the Hutus, who are the majority. And in the process, when the Belgians left, they left that notion, and they created a problem for the Tutsis because they have given them this assignment, and they now left, and they have to deal with the Hutus who were. So the British left, and here we are. The northern Nigerians said we have the majority, we are the majority population, and therefore everyone else must listen to us. And the British have divided Nigeria into three anyway, okay, with so many groups. So you have the Yorubas in the west, you have the Igbos in the east, and the Hausas in the north. But the presentation of a monolithic south or a monolithic north is itself a very dangerous argument, and it remains a dangerous argument even today. Because the north is not monolithic, it's not all Hausas, and it's not all Muslims. And the south is not monolithic, it's not all Christian, and it's not all Yorubas or only Igbos. Now, I must digress for a minute. Even the BBC, and I love BBC. Most of the news I read out of America is from BBC. But even BBC will always indicate, the conflict in today's life, mostly northern, is mostly between mostly northern Muslims versus southern Christians. But that's not the case. The Yorubas are in large part, Lagos used to be a large population of Muslims. Similarly, Lagos used to be a large number of Igbos before the war. So there were so many things. Lagos was a cosmopolitan city, and Lagos is close to 10 million people, and yet it's presented that. And there's almost 30% or so of Muslims among Yorubas. And there are a lot of Christians in northern Nigeria, but that's the image is presented. And that image plays into the nature of the conflict that we have today in Nigeria. Who's not following? Before I move on, who is not following? Does anyone want to stop me to clarify something? I know it's late, but I need to give you the dose of politics. Is that right? Who is not following before I move on to that? Anything else? Anyone? Okay. Provost, you told me CMU is that they're very sharp. I want to see the questions. I believe you, but I want to see the questions. Professor Mark, please. Go ahead. What were you going to say? You raised your hand.
No. You were asking who's been following, and I was just weighing in.
Okay, very good. Okay, so the state that was created under colonialism, and that applies to most of Africa, was a coercive state, and it is a coercive state today. The colonial state was an imposition that ruled with coercive apparatus. There was a colonial state, the colonial military, colonial everything. The post-colonial state inherited the coercive strong state. And that coercive state is what Nigerians are dealing with. So, if you want to understand the nature of conflict in Africa or in Nigeria, you have to look at the nature of the state itself and the nature of the creation of the state, or how the state has been constituted. So, many of these fringe groups, of course, some of their arguments are baseless. And indeed, you know, Boko Haram, one may argue that they don't necessarily understand Islam. Because if they understood Islam, you wonder why would they go and ravage villages that are all Muslim. Is that right? These guys are not, they are poor. They have not eaten. Why would they be killed? If the argument is against the state. But if, similarly, if their point is that, look, you don't know Islam, and therefore we want to give you Islam, then they should give the people the chance to be Muslims. Is that right? I can't tell you you're a bad Muslim when I didn't give you a chance to be a Muslim, I just killed you. Is that right? When will you going to be a good Muslim? So that's one of the things that they're going and like mad people, they are mad people, going around villages and killing everyone else. And they have not made the argument that, look, these people are bad Muslims and therefore we're going to bring them good Islam. Is that right? So you have that. In any case, the rise of Boko Haram has become very, very serious issue in Nigerian politics. Nigerian security and security challenges with the rise of Boko Haram have become a very serious thing in northern Nigeria. Everyone in northern Nigeria is scared, I can tell you that. Just yesterday, Boko Haram went and changed the name of the city in Adamawa. It's called Mubi, and they've called it, they've renamed it Medinatul Islam. Yesterday. So everybody's scared. Colleges are being closed. Schools are closed down in the whole region. So, I need a map of Nigeria. Really, I need a map of Nigeria with all the states so I can attempt to show some of the things that are going on. I messed up. I'm sorry. The concern with the current security is on the scale like when Nigeria had a civil war. Nigeria had a civil war 1966 to 1970. Thank you. That's the one I would like to have on there. So today's security concerns are on that scale. But if you don't understand that, our concerns about security are on the scale of the United States and most of Europe, as it is now about terrorism. We're so fearful of that. The transformation of this security concern has cut wide and deep in Nigerian society, and of course in the Nigerian politics itself. It has altered the notion of the survival of the state. Some of you who are, I think there are a few people here who study political science and international relations. The general argument in international relations is that indeed state security is about the external threat. Is that right? Most of the time when we talk about security to the state, it's about external threat. Well, in Nigeria, and certainly I can generalize about Africa, it is about the threat to the existence of the state itself in domestic context. So someone coming to invade, but right now in Nigeria we're concerned whether or not Nigeria will survive as one entity. Because whether we're thinking of whether to go back to the colonial dimension of creation, pre-colonial structure, as it were, or to maintain the state. Now, the state is an enduring thing in Africa. It's a colonial creation that has endured. And even where we try to argue in Nigeria whether to break it up or like the Sudanese did, to break it up, we're still creating a state system. Is that right? So there's an enduring, that's one thing that Europe, triumphant Europe is triumphant on that one. It created the state system for everyone, and everyone has come to believe it or accept it, whether they like it or not. That is the concept. And so we have altered the notion of state and threat to the state. This concept of state in Nigeria or challenge to the state is directly related to domestic stability and the existence of sovereignty of the nation. So the interactive nature of the conflict in northern Nigeria, where this conflict is, as it is today, it is in Adamawa, Gombe, Borno, Yobe. Those are the hotspot areas. Those 4 countries. A little bit has spilled into Bauchi State. So Bauchi State, Gombe, Yobe, Borno, Adama, and Taraba used to be one large state. When Nigeria had 12 states at the beginning of the creation of states from the 3 major regions. And those 2 areas, the northeast, are places where today it's difficult to travel, it's difficult to do things because Boko Haram, they were initially started in Borno, they were driven out, and then they're now in Adamawa. And Adamawa is where they're taking most of the territory and put up flags there. And it's, some of it is personal. My mother-in-law's house has been taken over, and they have put up a big flag in front of our house. There's a big tank, Boko Haram. So she's displaced, to say the least, in that context. So it's a very serious threat. But what are the central arguments about understanding the Nigerian security problem in terms of Boko Haram? Well, as students, we'll try to give you maybe some pointers so you can remember, just in case you want to write a paper down the line. One is that Boko Haram's domestic challenges are to the prevailing state structure. One of the first arguments they're making is the prevailing state structure. Some of them are, and there are different groups, there's a whole range of them, but some of them are arguing that the whole idea about Nigeria is just wrong. So they're arguing about that. That's the first challenge. The second pointer, central to understanding the Nigerian security problem, is the government is seen as the provider of social and economic services. So since the government is a provider of social services, the expectation is that the social services be delivered, and when the social services are not delivered, then there's a mounting challenge to this, to the state. Third, Boko Haram argues that indeed the political power sharing formulas, and Nigeria has all these political power sharing formulas. You guys challenge yourself and try to read about that. The political power sharing formulas that are created are just not favorable, they argue. Sometimes they argue that they are not favorable to the Muslims, or that they are not favorable to the North. And because the North, again, once again, is seen as predominantly Muslim Islam. So, the fourth argument they present is that the national revenue generation and revenue allocations, which is based on the oil economy, is something that's been challenged. That the formulas of revenue allocation, or the way revenue is generated, is not favorable, or that there is no equity to that formula. 5, there has been the crisis of legitimacy in Nigeria, and that crisis of legitimacy in Nigeria had formed the basis upon which Boko Haram is challenging the state. The crisis of legitimacy, so some of you know Nigeria, we had a series of military coups, and every election we have had, there's always a contest to that. There's what some people would say in Nigeria, campaign after the elections. The elections are held today, the results are in tomorrow, we start contesting the elections that we just had yesterday, because there's never been a legitimacy to many of those elections. No one has ever believed in these elections, especially in the Nigerian presidency. People have never really believed in the elections. We just accept what is being given, and we fight over it, and then we just say, okay, let's go on for another 4 years. But really, that guy is sitting in there, he's an illegal, you know, he's not the rightful person, he did not win the election, and all this stuff. So, compared to elections, Tuesday, by midnight, if you're still worried about COVID or wolf, you were left out laughing in the cold. Is that right? The elections were over. Get over it in America. Is that right? Everybody gets onto that. Well, in Nigeria, it's possible, and like most of Africa, by extension, in the Middle East, I think, people do learn how to fly helicopters the next day after the elections. Is that right? You got to shoot the neighbor here somehow. In that. And so the crisis of legitimacy remains a very big point, obstacle to or a challenge to that. Number 6, one of the reasons for all these arguments is the idea that the income disparities and poverty levels that are witnessed in Nigeria, either between the elites and the masses, or between northern Nigeria and southern Nigeria, these are always presented that way. Now, rightly or wrongfully, these are the images that we come to see about that. But the income disparity between the elites in Nigeria is very high. Professor Mark, you've been there, you've seen that. And I've been in this country long enough to know that the disparities are narrower than Nigeria, because in Nigeria, you see a $5 million house, and then you find a $50 house. That's not fair, is that right? $5 million house lying next to a shank of $50. Because you can translate your $15 to so much naira and build up a little house. The disparity is just glaring. And, of course, the name of Boko Haram, the idea that Western education is forbidden or is illegitimate or whatever, is the idea that Boko, meaning Western education, has given you everything and not me. Is that right? The Boko Haram. So Boko is haram. They are saying that education, by definition, is giving everyone everything. So the elites are riding big cars, big homes, and the rest, everybody. So you have all these arguments and that. But, I mean, they have contradiction to some of their statements, because many of them are using Boko in whatever way to their own advantage and attacking society and that. Anyway, number 7, another crucial factor to understanding the security issue is the so-called external and regional dimension to Boko Haram's operational activities. The operational activities of Boko Haram is that we are surrounded by countries who are also contesting the argument of legitimacy of the state. So our borders are porous. We're next to Cameroon, we're next to Niger, we're next to Chad, we're next to everyone. Is that right? Because like in Africa, everybody is bordered by some arbitrary state that's been created. So these guys can run into that state, come back, and run them back. So the operational ground for Boko Haram, the theater of war, if you want to use that, is large. The theater of war is Cameroon. The theater of war is Chad. The theater of war is Niger. They're everywhere. They could go anywhere. And they operated out of, now in some instances with impunity, because one state may be protecting them, or the nature of corruption, which is the next point, may be the basis of that. So that the historical experience in Africa of this arbitrary mapping of borders allows the operational grounds to be larger than expected in that. And so then number 8, you have the ethno-religious divisions in Nigeria. Ethno-religious divisions. I've alluded to that. I spoke about that. The idea that the ethnic groups have come to believe seriously that they are different and that they have different religious values. Northern Nigeria sees itself as House of Fulani Muslim. So much so that sometimes the idea of even acknowledging that Yorubas are Muslims becomes difficult. A lot of Yorubas, as I told you, almost 25 to 30% of Yorubas in Western Nigeria are Muslims. But that ethno-religious divisions in Nigeria have become a basis of understanding the imperatives of their argument. That doesn't make it right, but that's what is being seen. And lastly, the official government corruption. Official government corruption in Nigeria has become the basis for understanding this conflict. And let me just give you a quick scenario. Right now, every Nigerian, at least most Nigerians in northern Nigeria, the lay people, the so-called lay people, think or argue that the reason why Boko Haram is able to continue its attacks with impunity is because government officials are easily bribed, the police are easily bribed, the security agents are easily bribed, and then therefore they can go and take these towns. So there's a police roadblock, and these guys are coming in large numbers, and the police do nothing, or the security people do nothing. So the locals are wondering what is happening, and they are arguing the conclusion that they are being corrupted. All the arms that Boko Haram uses are mostly from the Nigerian military. Whether they are seized or abandoned, people argue, why would that happen? If the state has not been able to protect its own people because of the level of corruption in society, then you wonder what is happening. So, what is ethnic politics, therefore? I'm going to cover 2 grounds and then we'll try to end it. Ethnic politics, of course, as I mentioned, is a major force in Nigerian politics. It has kept the society divided at different levels or at some levels. At some levels it may not have been divided in Nigeria, but at some levels it's divided. It remains a formidable force or danger to the Nigerian security as long as society remains divided. And it remains a formidable force to Nigeria's existence as an entity in that it appears as though the so-called ethnic affiliations that we have given to Hausa, Igbo, and Yoruba are very intense. So sometimes I don't necessarily buy into this ethnic conflict model, really. I think it's been oversold. But you have to make the argument that the affiliations assigned have become so intense, and everyone has come to pretend as though Nigeria is only 3 groups, as though we are only Hausas, only Igbos, and only Yorubas. The rest people do not matter, and that everything is within the context of that regional argument. And as I mentioned before, the power sharing that is engineered by the PDP, People's Democratic Party, which is the ruling party, and to some extent along the lines of the so-called national character. The national character argument, similar to some of the things you do in America. Here's how it is done in Nigeria. If the president is a Muslim, the vice president has to be Christian. If the president is from the south of Nigeria, the vice president has to be a northerner. This is our national character argument. So some of it makes sense. But the idea that, therefore, we have come to create some formulas, including what they call zoning system, and that's the central part of the argument today in Nigeria's security problems. We have zoned these positions. So we had a president who was a northerner. So he died in office 2 years before the completion of his term. So his vice president is a southerner. So the vice president constitutionally becomes the president. But the problem is that we have this zoning system, or the rotation, that the presidency should have been in the north. So how do you resolve the zoning system with the constitutional argument? And that's what we have. Jonathan Goodluck, we call him Goodluck Nigeria. Goodluck Jonathan was the vice president of Yar'Adua, and when Yar'Adua died, by any measure, the constitutional requirement is Jonathan becomes president, which he did. But there are people who then went to argue that, okay, look, when you finish your 2 terms, you must leave, because the presidency belongs to the north in terms of zoning. But who in their right mind would give up power? Who would? The student of political science here, where are you? Power is, we argue that indeed everything is about power. Is that right? The political science is about power. So here we have someone who is there, and he sees himself as popular, and all of a sudden somebody said, well, you've got to move out off the stage because it is not your time to run for the presidency, because it belongs to the north. So we have all this argument, and the ethnicity become very so it has been a politicized consciousness of identity in Nigeria. That conscious identity has become a constant reference. People constantly refer to that. I'm a southerner, I'm a northerner, I'm a Muslim, I'm a Christian, and all this. And of course, if you feel alienated from the political system, this characterization will put you in a disadvantage. You're alienated from the system, and many groups do that. So, some of the arguments in Boko Haram presents that they have been denied, or that's not Boko Haram does not speak for the North, because, as I said, they've been going around killing everyone indiscriminately. Is that right? But yet, those are the kind of sentiments presented. So, what's the religious politics in Nigeria? Quickly, religious conflicts have been central to politics in Nigeria. Every government since 1960, when Nigeria became independent, military, civilian, whatever, had made a determined effort to deal with the so-called spontaneous eruptions and the deep-seated grievances. So you can make the distinction between spontaneous riots and deep-seated grievances. And the deep-seated grievances have been expressed both in terms of religious and ethnic terms. For example, at one point Nigeria had two insurgencies, one in the south, and that was a deep-seated grievance that was presented by people in the Niger Delta who produce the oil, and yet they are denied the benefits of the oil by the state. Not by particular regions, but by the state. And the state was instrumental in hanging some of those people, Ken Saro-Wiwa and the rest, and along with the BP, oil companies and the rest. They just collided to kill those people because they protested the pollution that was created in their own area. So you have deep-seated grievances and spontaneous. Every government in Nigeria has attempted to deal with those kind of things. Similarly, the conflicts, the religious conflicts in Nigeria have been between secular or secularism and the conception of the Islamic/the Christian state. Most of the time, people in the north who have always, for those who believe in the caliphate system, had seen themselves as projecting a state with an Islamic image versus a secular state or a Christian view of the state. And those views are constant and prevalent in many areas. So, northern Nigeria, at one particular state, some of those states, Zamfara, Kano, and the rest, not only toyed with, but actually attempted to institute Sharia law. And Sharia is basically an attempt to establish basic practices of Muslims on those Muslims. So it may sound very harsh from a Western perspective. They're going to establish Sharia. Woo. But the Sharia is basically Islamic law, basically. They want to institute Islamic law. Sharia is just Islamic law or Islamic practices. Now, the problem with that is that you cannot attempt to establish Islamic practices when the state is composed of many other people other than Muslims. Is that right? So it becomes difficult in that. So in Zamfara, for example, they said, okay, we don't want women to take the same buses with men. Okay, but how are you going to go and tell a Christian woman or a Christian man, okay, don't go and take the same bus with women when that law does not apply to you? Is that right? That's one of the things that we face in that. Or, okay, we don't want to have you establish bars and all these things in one area. Okay, so if you're a Muslim, maybe that's appropriate. But what happens if you're a Christian? Somebody is trying to deny you from what you think you're going to do, and this is supposed to be a democratic state. So you have all these complications in that. So northern Muslim groups, in general, in terms of the Islamic politics, in terms of religious politics, northern Muslim groups have traditionally been the more volatile source of uprising in Nigeria. Most of the religious uprisings in general have been mostly from northern Muslim groups. But that's not to say that's the only one. I'm just saying there have been more. There, we don't have the time to make that argument, but there have been religious riots in the south. There have been uprisings and insurgencies that are religiously connected. As a matter of fact, one of the leading insurgent leader in the Delta, what's his name now? His name is escaping me, but he's a Muslim, and Dokumbo was a Muslim, and he was considered one of the most violent, fierce people. So it's not necessarily only in the north, in that context, but you can make the general argument that the most uprisings, religious uprisings, come from that. So religious politics have been encouraged by the state itself. The state encouraged that. And there are many instances where the state will either support a group with a religious argument, or oppose a group with a religious argument. And it's been very confusing for a lot of people. In the 1980s, especially, those things happened constantly. The confrontation between the government and the general public by Islamic fringe groups have risen because sometimes the government plays into that, does favors to some of these groups, and those groups become very violent, or the government will look away because they are in support of that particular policy. So the confrontations have become rather large in that context and varied. So the Christian groups have also responded. They have responded in varied forms in Nigeria to Islamic movements, especially by the Christian Association of Nigeria, CAN, CAN, Christian Association of Nigeria. They have responded in different ways to some of these issues. I think my phone is ringing somehow. So because they have responded in that, it has complicated, the conflicts have complicated the state, and some of the inequities that exist in terms of power distribution or resource distribution have promoted the conflict in that. So it brings us to the last part of it, and then we can try to make the conclusion to some of this statement. The idea that Nigeria or northern Nigeria is monolithic, and the idea that southern Nigeria is monolithic in its conception of either Christianity or Islam have become very, very serious challenges to the state itself. The state has promoted that. The three groups have promoted that conception, and groups such as Boko Haram, or in the 1980s in Kano, Maitasine riots in Kano, and others, have taken that dimension. They've taken the dimension of both ethnicity and religiosity to attack the state. So when Boko Haram was founded in the 1990s, first everybody saw it as though, well, it's a northern problem. Or people saw it as a Muslim problem. Nobody imagined that it will affect the whole state. And the northerners thought it is in their neighborhood, or perhaps it's being used to attack the southerners, and therefore nobody bothered. Nobody took it seriously, or they did not see the challenge as something serious in that. But the nature of democracy in Nigeria itself called into question about government response to that. How could a state not protect its own citizens? Why is the state not interested in resolving the religious crisis? Why is the state interested in somehow keeping the argument going? So here's what is going on today, just for you to see the dimension of that. People in the north believe, most of the mass rural people believe that, look, the reason why they are being killed with great impunity is because Jonathan Goodluck, the Nigerian president, does not like the north, and therefore is not ready to protect them from being killed. Goodluck sees the argument that, look, these northerners do not like me anyway, and they don't want me to run for office again because they think it is their turn to have the presidency, and therefore they have unleashed this Islamic group to create insecurities, instabilities, and ungovernable position for him. Everyone is using the religious argument to present their point. Meantime, the sad thing, of course, the public is being killed. Is that right? Doesn't matter how they conceptualize the argument. For the northerners, if they argue that the government or the state is standing still, their hands folded, and watching them being killed, and they in turn have not done anything to address that kind of, I mean, I'm exaggerating, the people have not done anything. But if you put it in that context, then you will understand that they're trying to use religious arguments for that. Similarly, the president may be using religious arguments to present his argument on that. No. So what's the conclusion for this? Quickly, I didn't want to make three major arguments in terms of the nature of religion and politics, or the dominant role of Islam. One, I think northern Nigeria, the history of northern Nigeria, on the basis of the Islamic revivalist movement of the 19th century, establishing the kind of state, the caliphate, had endured in its argument that they want an Islamic society. But that doesn't not necessarily wrong for people demanding what they want. But that argument of an Islamic society may have to come under the context of the secular modern state, or at least having some kind of regional autonomy that allows northern Nigeria to do that without interfering with the rest of the state. So we have to, that has to be balanced out. I don't know how we're going to sort it out, but that has to be balanced out. In other words, you cannot have a purely Islamic state in the midst of other people that are not Muslims. You will have to, at least from a democratic theory standpoint, you will have to infringe on the benefit, on the rights of the other people if you want to establish a theocratic state in that context. The second thing I think one can look at in perhaps in conflict resolution, but certainly in addressing the security challenge, is that the state has to be legitimized. We have to create legitimate processes. The state has not been accepted as it is. No one has accepted the state, and that applies to most of Africa, as I mentioned before. The state is a contested argument, and nowhere more than Nigeria itself, where we have not really bought into this idea about the colonial state. So now, if you, again, from a democratic standpoint, if it's a fair state, a democratic state, then every religion will be allowed to exist and prosper as it wants. So maybe the reason of all this hoopla is because maybe there are no legitimate processes in that. And thirdly, which relates, comes out of the two arguments, is that indeed the reason for the failure of the state to act or protect people is official government corruption. And official government corruption has to be addressed in order to deal with the security problem or address it properly. Because there are few instances where the Boko Haram leaders were arrested and next day they disappeared. Or, according to what the president quoted many times, whatever is discussed at the higher security levels some of it finds itself somewhere among Boko Haram people. So somebody's being corrupted somewhere. Is that right? So unless those issues are addressed, I think it will be problematic. So many of you are professors know that professors love their voices. So I want to speak more, but I have to worry that it's late afternoon, so I'm trying to give up. So let's hear questions. The teachers, by the way, not professors, but teachers, we love our voice. What do you think? So we want to give up on that and let other people speak. So any questions for me?